Okay, so welcome, Joe and Andy, and anyone else who's going to pop in for this final session in our sort of into 2025 series. We've looked at thought leadership and we've looked at research insights to shape communications in the year ahead. And now we're going to be looking, spend the next half an hour or so having a discussion about case studies, which one client of ours described as gold dust. So this may or may not be case studies for you in terms of the case studies could be you could be a supplier and it could be your customer case studies, you could be internal and it could be case studies of what's going on in the organization. But you know, basically, I thought that was quite a powerful thing when someone's saying this was a vendor and they are really important bits of content. So what we're going to do in the next half an hour, before I do introductions, sorry, wait a minute, and while I ruin the deck, we're going to have a quick look at, I'm going to quickly look at the context for this. Our version is just arriving. Hi, Virginie. We're just going to we've just started, so welcome.
Thank you. Hi,
Nice to see
everyone.
you.
Yeah, thanks.
So I was just saying that it's this third in our series. We're going to do it'll be 45 minutes max, and we're just going to be looking at case studies, and I'm going to be talking about a bit of the context as to why they're important, and Roisin, my colleague, is going to talk about the actual nuts and bolts of case studies. Roisin, do you want to quickly introduce yourself for those that don't know you?
Sure. I'm Roisin Woolnough, and I work with Martin Insights Media. I've been a writer for over 20 years, started in B2B journalism, to do a mix of B2B journalism still and sort of content marketing and copywriting. So I've written a lot of case studies over the years, and it's quite interesting to see how they've changed from when I started out. You know, a case study now isn't the way that I used to write case studies sort of 20 plus years ago, but I'll talk about that in a bit.
Great, thank you. And we're sort of just fresh out of finishing off a quite a big case study project actually for UK research and innovation. So they're very much on our mind because we've been working on this 6-month project. So that's been quite interesting in itself. So we may come on to some of the things we've learned from that. So thanks, Roisin. I'm going to quickly talk about the first couple of points. Just I thought I'd just pull in a little bit of context here as to why they're important. And FT Longitude, they're like a thought leadership agency that the Financial Times bought. So they do lots of big projects and they do quite a lot of research around kind of thought leadership and content marketing more broadly. So externally, they've done some research around executive buyers, and I thought this was quite interesting in terms of the importance of case studies in terms of influencing people in terms of their thinking, and it's the number one preferred type of. You want me to go into slideshow, Virginie? Oh, sorry, everyone. Let me do that. Wait a minute. Can you see that better? Right. Virginie, that's what we're going to talk about, just in case you hadn't seen that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do the first 2 points now. And so can you see that?
Yes, thank you.
A bit better. So it's just, this was some research of, and I can share the links. This is of kind of executives buyers basically. So they find case studies the most powerful type of content, but interestingly, all of those types of content are really important. So, I mean, this is in the kind of thought leadership context, but anything that is research based, tells a story from a customer perspective, includes evidence and data, is basically what people are interested in, and increasingly they're interested in practical tips. So it's not just what the data tells us this; it's like, actually, this is what you need to be doing, and here are some examples. And that's kind of where the case studies really do come into their own. I then looked at, there's quite a lot of the Content Marketing Institute and this company called Demand Gen. They do annual sort of content surveys, and I thought this was quite interesting, just in terms of a bit of context. You know, what do buyers want from their content? And they don't want it, they really don't want so much sales messaging, which is not surprising, and I think we know that. I think it's this idea of using more data and research to support claims. I think is really important, and also the business value. And actually, you could overlay case studies across those two bottom points, because you do get data from case studies, and you basically should be demonstrating business value. So there's just a kind of broader trend, I think, that especially from an external perspective, buyers, you know, are expecting more focus on value, more focus on data and research, and basically case studies are a really good way of doing that, and less selling. So, and you see that as well, Joe. Yeah, I think it's really interesting because you manage a lot of content, don't you? Especially on the supply side. So I'm presuming, tell me if I'm wrong, you spend a lot of time kind of turning down the volume on the sales messaging and turning up the volume on what actually someone knows, and, you know, kind of value.
And it goes, and it's slightly different depending on kind of what the piece is. So we have a separation between editorial articles and somebody who's paid for an article specifically to promote themselves. So I've got a client at the moment who's doing both. So their editorial piece, it said, in our product we do X, da, 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 da. And I've edited that to go, in world-class products they do X. But then in the one they've paid for, they can go buy our stuff. But you're right about, you know, the links and what you know. And then I'm always saying to people as well, I want your story, your journey, your experience. So that kind of goes in with that value piece, I think, a little bit more, because the value is what you as an individual have seen or done or something like that.
And I haven't met, I mean, it's a good point. I think the other thing I would add is there are just this idea of social proof, and really buying from trusted, credible organizations who are doing similar things to similar people or for similar people to me. I think this is just, you know, that's not a surprise. That's how it works in the consumer world as well. But it really does, it's powerful in business to business. I mean, so much so that I remember going to, I think it was Nationwide years ago, talking to their HR director, and they were looking for a new learning and development director, I think, or someone quite senior in the learning team, and they just wanted someone who could implement a system that a competitor had. And that was one of the main things of the job. They wanted to bring a new system in, and you just think, wow, you know, it goes to that sort of length, really. So yeah, it's really, it's interesting. And I think when in the buying process, so this bit of research from the same Demand Gen report just shows beyond awareness, once someone's a bit more interested, then in what you've got to offer, then case studies are by far and away the most useful content. You know, people instantly, it's not far into getting some awareness of someone that they actually want to see how that's working for other people, basically. So they're actually hugely important. wait a minute, sorry, I'm going to do one more thing here, and that is we had, so for context, about a year ago, I looked at a random sample of 25 exhibitors at World of Learning and looked at their case studies or not. And out of 25, 11, so nearly 50% didn't have any case studies. And then it went from 1 to 4, and then I think some had like 10 plus case studies. So actually, it's quite difficult for a lot of organizations to do. And the second thing was that there was very little of the customer voice in the case studies. So what they would say is, and also it would, in a learning context, the value and impact would be framed in learning outcomes. So it's like, we really enjoyed doing this thing. It was great. The product was great. And that's about as far as it went. So there was very little on sort of overall business value and impact. And I know that it's easy to say, and I hear this from vendors. The problem is, and everyone on the call today will know this, that actually learning teams have that challenge anyway to prove value and impact. So it doesn't make it any easier for a vendor to do it either. But actually, then I think there's a growing sense of being able to need to be able to do that. And we're going to see more and more of that. I think the whole sort of performance impact, measuring that kind of impact is definitely on the agenda more than ever. And I think case studies are a really interesting way of cutting through with that. So that leads me on nicely to Roisin, and I'll Roisin, I think we had a couple of questions when we set this up about what makes a great study and how to create ones. So are those, we were discussing whether they are too similar, those two questions, but you had a good thought on how you can talk to both of those. So I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, they are quite similar because in a sense, making a great case study, you have to know how to make it interesting, useful, informative, relevant, up to date, all those kind of things. But they're kind of two sides of a coin, really. So yeah, going back to when I started writing case studies, sort of 20 years ago, then I think case studies were very much kind of on the side. You'd be writing a piece and a case study be there to as backup to illustrate what you're saying. And they were quite formulaic, and it was a lot about data. They were quite dry. They weren't the main bit of the story. Well, that's certainly how, I was writing them for a B2B. You'd have, say, a feature, and then there'd be a box or two, kind of the case study. But I think that's changed hugely now. You get so many case studies stand on their own. They might be the first thing you see when you go on a website. They're certainly a lot less formulaic and a lot more interesting. The data needs to be there, but to help tell the story. So I think there's been quite a big shift, certainly for me, in terms of writing them and how you approach them. So what makes a great case study? So there's one organization we work for, and I've written over 100 case studies for them over the past 7-8 years, and they're often a similar theme, and I need to cover some themes each time. And one of the things that stops it getting boring for me to write is that usually I interview 1 or 2 people for the case study. And it's always good because then you get to hear their voice, their story. And some of the stories I hear are really, very compelling. And so that helps to keep it fresh and alive for me writing it, because I might have, say, 6 points that I need to cover, and I've covered them all in these case studies many times before. But in a sense, I think interviewing people and talking to them, because very easily they could just send through some points and I could do it from that. But I think one of the ways to make a case study really compelling when you're interviewing people is to actually talk to them, because people are surprising. They tell you stuff that you're not expecting, or you hear their story. And that's really what can make a case study stand out, because it brings it to life, I think. Particularly if you're writing for an organization and they produce many of these, because again, the audience could think, well, I've seen something very similar. So using that customer voice, whether it's the employee or a customer, that's one of the best ways to do it. And you can center it around that. I mean, you can lead in with it, or you can use quotes to, really emphasize a point. And also when you're using a quote, people can say things that you wouldn't necessarily say out of a quote. It can make it much more emphatic and direct. So that's one of the really important ways to make a good case study. And it makes it much more interesting when you're writing it, because then also you get to ask questions that lead on from your original question. Someone tells you something, you say, oh, that's interesting, tell me more about that, or how did this go? And that's when you also get the really good learning that you can bring into the case study, the lessons that they learned, the lessons the organization learned, what they might want to share, with your intended audience, to give us your top 5 tips for, I write about apprenticeships quite a lot, your top 5 tips for how you make an apprenticeship work, because it's not easy. So I'd say that's definitely one of the main things, getting to the people who they've got the story to tell, because a case study is essentially a story. The case study the project we've just finished with, so I had to write 15 case studies. And again, you can have competing kind of stakeholders, really. You've got the person you're interviewing, you've got the organization, people might want slightly different things to come out of it. So you have a certain responsibility towards people to kind of, help them say what they want to say and represent them accordingly. And again, with that one, there was 16 case studies with the same overall theme. So so someone were to read all of them together, how do you make it so that it's not boring or doesn't get repetitive? Again, that's a large part is listening to people. It's very easy to go in knowing what you want to say. And although, you need to have done your preparation and stuff, I think if you let people tell you, that can help avoid the repetition, because otherwise you don't want to lead them down a certain path. You need to let those kind of nuggets come out.
Can I?
Yeah.
Can I just jump in there, Roisin? Because I'm just because I think it's I don't know what everyone else thinks, but I think it sounds devilishly simple at this point, right? But the thing is, lots of people find it incredibly hard to do case studies in the first place, to make them happen, don't they? And I think, and the other thing is, they can be very, very managed. So there's very high expectations and a lot of control put around them. And what you're saying is the cut through comes from the story. And that means talking to the right person and really being able to get under the skin of the thing that you're talking about, because they're going to share something that, if you have like a corporate comms person in the room or a PR person, they're probably going to share some stuff in their own words that might make those people bristle a bit, because it's like, oh, can't say it like that, or can we really say that? But actually, that isn't that the stuff that normally turns into really good quotes, or can really tell the story more emphatically.
Yeah, well, as the person sort of doing the interviewing and doing the writing, I mean, you have to be mindful of who it is that you're talking to and the company that you represent. So obviously you don't, if someone says something and sometimes you think, oh, that's a great line, but it's not really, it's not going to land very well with the organization. So you do need to manage it and be a bit pragmatic about sort of exactly how you use quotes. It might be that you need to paraphrase something rather than having a direct quote. And that's also about having conversations with the PR or the corporate person who's set the interview up about what makes a good case study and how this is going to appear to your audience. So that's another part of the process. That's partly about setting it up well in the first place, so everyone's agreed about what the case study, what makes a good case study, what they're trying to get out of it, how you want it to look, what kind of story you want it to be able to say. And I think there's a thing with, I mean, the case study, it sounds a bit boring, doesn't it? I think, you know, blogs, white papers, they sound a bit more fun. But actually, a case study is basically writing a story. And it can be quite a challenge because you might have only 400 words. There might be a certain formula you've got to fit. You know, personally, I quite enjoy that kind of challenge. So I think, yeah, I think that can be an issue, that people think it sounds a bit boring. But there's no reason for them to be, really.
Yeah, and I think what I find quite interesting actually is the idea that having doing them across even in a sector like learning and development, for example. So you'd say, well, actually, it's all fairly similar, you know, but actually, it's not. It's all so context specific, and you know, it's specific to a particular audience in a specific organization within a specific industry sector. And I think that's the point about, you know, we're talking about social proof, but actually there are other people in that position that will be interested in that story. And I think it's just being able to really get to the story, isn't it? I think that's what everyone's saying in the chat. It's like, actually, you know, it's hard to get that, and it takes quite a lot of work. One thing I was going to add actually is we're going to do some more of these sessions in the new year with some of our customers, and one of them has agreed to do one on case studies, and they do use a lot of them to great effect, and said, actually, how do you use them? And this is quite a good list, I thought. So actually, that idea of trying to, you know, get beyond those who are risk averse in the organisation to make them happen. If you think about them, also they said directly with potential clients, potentially useful in tenders, follow up thought leadership pieces, events, and sales meetings, in government relations because they also work with the government, and via internal comms to show impact. And I thought, well, actually, if the whole organisation was to think about this stuff in those terms, it would be like that. I think it comes back to the idea of seeing it as gold dust. It's like you would really, yeah, you'd really want to kind of sell it in and really make it as powerful as possible. So, Virginie, what was the goal of this webinar? Did you see the?
No, I'm talking about the one that Joe hosted, you know, because if they wanted to have a case study about a strategy but didn't want to share the real strategy, then you wonder why they wanted to have this case study in the first instance, you see? And isn't that the goal? I mean, to understand, you know, when you're writing a case study, why do you want to write this case study? What is the goal of that? If they do not want to share the real story about it, if they want to hide some of the things, why?
Yeah. I think it's a good, and I don't know what you think, Roisin, but I think it's also, if you're going to do the interviews, you're going to get the truth, potentially. And it's going to be, you know, the actual project will be talked about in the terms of the person you're interviewing. And I think that's that's hugely powerful. That is, you know, that can be the customer voice. And I think there tends to be a risk aversion around that. There was a discussion on LinkedIn about case studies, and you know, if you're doing an awards entries, then you've probably got the basis for something there. But people don't necessarily do case studies off the back of awards entries, which is quite interesting. So actually, you can, you know, if you win an award, then it's all very public. But it's interesting how many of those awards they're talked about in terms of winning an award, but do you see the case study that goes behind it? Not all the time, which is quite interesting. So even when there is something very public, people find it hard to talk about what has actually gone on. Sorry, Roisin.
No, I think Andy's point there about, what went wrong, lessons learned. It's what people want to hear about, because if say you're selling a product or something, and you're addressing people's pain points, there's a case study where someone's talking about their pain points and how these have been addressed, and that's a lot more compelling than if you're just saying, oh, we're really good at doing this and that. And it brings it to life. And it might be pain points that another customer has. So I think it's a shame when people are nervous about saying this was a difficulty we had, or we ran into problems here, because usually it's when you're going into the nitty-gritty of problems that you find those interesting solutions. And if you share them, and it also makes a case study seem a lot more real, much less like marketing, and more like something that people will trust, which I think, again, it's going to be better for your brand than just some kind of bland, oh, we did amazingly well at this, which people are just going to skim read and forget about. Because I think because the whole point of the story is you can make some kind of connection with it. And usually for a connection, I guess there needs to be a problem. That's a kind of hook, in a sense, like telling any story.
So I think I don't know what you think. So Andy's put in a really good question about PR teams are often nervous about showing their vulnerabilities. So I think there's a couple of things. I don't know what you would say about this, Roisin, but from my experience of interviewing people as a journalist with PRs in the room, it's an interesting kind of dynamic, because there is a definite, there's a definite desire for the person being interviewed to toe a particular line. But the reality is that you're there to ask questions and get the story. And so sometimes that you're asking that person to probably, kind of be a bit more honest than what the kind of corporate line might be. So in answer to that question, it's like you have to be able to start to talk to the business about this, about what makes a good story, both internally and externally. And I think there's an education piece. You've got to remember that PR, its roots are in making something look good. Its roots are not in telling the story as it is. That was journalism's role. You've got this, but the thing is that it's become so much more blurred now, because PR people know the power of the story. So therefore, it's actually, I think it's about educating people. So it's, and that's hard to do when you're just kind of turning up and you want to just get a case study, say for a book or whatever. But I mean, basically, you've got to engage with the stakeholders around that story and say, look, I think you've got a great story here. If you can do an interview and get the story, and then be able to sit down with people and say, this is really powerful. There's a lot of scope to use this, and then try and engage around that, I think is also another way to do it. But I think it's hard. But I think there's a job to be done in terms of educating stakeholders, actually. And it comes back to what Virginie is saying. So, well, what is the point of this? If the aim is to provide a powerful story that's going to get people engaged with your organization, the challenges you have and how you overcome them, then you've got to run with a story that's really going to do that. What I would come back to, sorry, Roisin, I'll be quiet in a sec. It's like when I did that look at 25 case studies, none of them did this really. They had hardly any quotes from people in the business. It was very kind of, we did this, learners did this, and then that's about it really, and everyone was happy. And that was quite vanilla. And actually, it doesn't really tell you much. Or coming back to the first couple of slides I shared, people want the impact, they want the data, they want to know what the problem was, they want to know what the solution was. That's what they want. So it's arguably, why would you invest in doing lots of case studies that just say our learners did this program and they loved it? It's not that. Really isn't what people are looking for. Sorry, Roisin.
It's fine. No, at all. Andy, you had your hand up. Did you have a question still, or has it passed?
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, apologies for my surroundings, which is why the camera's off. I think for me, it's and my one came from when I was writing my first book. I had some wonderful case studies, but we just couldn't get them through the PR teams, because anything which had any sense of weakness or whatever, I just hit the corporate wall on them. And I guess the question is, and it's perhaps not an easy answer, but your perspectives are really valued. How do we help PR teams understand that actually saying the company had an issue is which they've overcome, is a really positive message? And for me, it's almost a bit like, you watch the adverts on TV, and it says 95% of 4 people said this shampoo makes your hair shiny. I mean, this whole engine of presenting things in a false positivity is, and that's what I really struggled with. I just don't know if you've got any tips about how we can coach PR teams who obviously are very, very worried about this kind of stuff, to actually say, lowering your guard is perhaps something which will actually help your brand massively, as opposed to us just keep talking. So does that make sense? So any tips you've got about it, in the space of a very short time frame with a PR team, to help them to understand that actually sharing negatives is actually a really powerful thing for them to do? This is
probably more a question for Martin, but what I would quickly say is that it might also be worth going beyond the PR team, because some organizations are just very controlling, and some organizations I think you're always going to struggle to get a decent case study out of, because they'll want to have their fingers all over it. But sometimes it's a matter of, as Martin said, educating people, and you might want to bring in some other people from the business who might understand the value in a more honest and a more kind of constructive case study. And it's about, people need to have respect for other people's disciplines, in a sense. PR do a certain kind of thing, marketing does something else. If you're sort of a journalist or a content writer, again, you do something else, business development. So I think it's a matter of quite a lot of conversation happening before you get to write the case study in that kind of scenario. So everyone understands what the purpose is, and how it might look and how to manage that. I don't know, what do you think, Martin?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think I'd say there's a this is a persistent challenge. This is not something that is new, and it's certainly not something that's going away anytime soon. But what I would say is, it then becomes incumbent on you or us to set out some of the research that we were talking about earlier. People that are interested, if you look at the purpose of the case study, and then you look at the fact that your potential audience actually values this type of information, I think that has to be laid out, and there is evidence for that. So that's a sort of background stuff. I think you then have to have a quick look, and it doesn't have to be too long, but you look at what they put out already, and you look at what some of their competitors put out. Even if it's something for a book, you're just like, well, where are the stories? And then, because what will be interesting is if, it's, maybe this isn't the best example, but if the competitor organization is being featured in Harvard Business Review, for example, that might actually wake them up to the fact that if you're going to be featured in there, you're probably going to have to talk about your problems and how you overcame them, because there's just no way they're going to talk about you if you can't do that. So it's a bit like, making the case. But I think definitely having a look at, what they're putting out already, and bringing some research in to say, well, this is what this audience actually really wants, and then having a conversation about, well, so this case study can actually help you reach the right kind of audience in a credible and trustworthy way. And that's the big thing at the moment, is also that building of trust and credibility. And that's how you have to do it, because people can see through the gloss. So I think it's that makes your life, everything I've just described there is more time consuming for you, but actually it's probably what you need to be doing. I mean, those are the kinds of things, because you can only point out what what people see of that organization. And there's a huge opportunity. That's the other thing right now. There's a massive opportunity, because there's a sea of the same sort of stuff in most sectors. So it's the ones that stand out. Get a good case study. You then understand the other thing about is the opportunity cost here. So if you've got a great case study, then you can start platforming someone and something. And that becomes very interesting, because you can get them into events, you can get them onto webinars, you can get them into the media. The actual benefit of getting it out there in a decent story in an engaging way is probably will delight a PR team. But you don't get that with stuff that's very anodyne. And no one, Jo is running Training Journal. I'm sure she would say what she would expect from something that she would really push, and it would be that the stories that you would like to write, Andy, rather than the ones that corporates give. And yeah, so it does. There is a bit of education, a bit of making the case. I think a bit of looking at the competition, and also looking at the opportunity, because it's quite. There is a lot of opportunity. Your customers start to tell your story for you, or your employees as advocates, then people really do listen to that. So it's not to be underestimated. Sorry, where have we got to? 11:40.
There's a question from Virginia. Sorry, just said that correctly? Virginie, sorry.
Yeah.
Do I start an interview with a structure in mind? Well, a really important thing is going in, having done your homework. Now, I've done quite a lot of case studies with academics, and they can be quite hard to start with, because they might, people don't always like journalists, we're not very popular. So sometimes it can be quite resistant. And if they can see that you know what that you're talking about, and you've done your preparation, and you're genuinely interested, then the conversation sort of gets to flow a lot better, and they open up. So I think you go into an interview with your questions and with an idea, and obviously if you've got a brief, you've been talking to an organization, if they've asked you to do something, you know what they want. But I think it's always important to have an open mind. And sometimes this comes back to what makes a compelling case study. You might want to turn the usual structure on its head. You might want to start with a quote or a stat or something. What's going to make it really interesting? I mean, some organizations have a very certain formula they want you to follow, but you still need to follow the kind of the who, what, where, why, when, how of journalism, and think about how you're going to make it interesting, how you're going to make people want to read it, how you're going to make them read to the end. So you don't want to be kind of constrained by structure, but you definitely, I think, approach an interview, ready. I mean, it's also just polite if someone's given you their time, so that you're ready to hit the ground running. I mean, I've done a lot of technical case studies where I really do need to, quantum physics and stuff, areas that I'm not at all comfortable with. And and you really do need to have some sense of what you're talking about. But you can be honest. When I'm doing heavily scientific things, I do say, look, I'm not even a scientific journalist. This is not my area. So you'll have to explain things. But I think you set things up well if you're going in prepared and at least an idea of what you want from it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
And I think also I'd add to that, I think the context, just saying, just find out a little bit about that person, their background, how long have they been doing what they've been doing. And I think also, I mean, I know that you do this all the time, Roisin. It's just that idea of listening to what is being said and then carrying on with questions. When you think they've said something interesting, then you want them to expand on that. That's, I think, becomes, you can really get to some interesting things there. And the other thing I was going to add is that one thing that's worked well for this project recently is everyone wants video as well and graphics. But if you do a written interview first, one method that we've used is we can then go back to that person and say, can we do a video? But actually, these are the things we'd like to cover in the video. And you just pull them out from the written stuff. So they've already done it. So actually, it can be a lot easier for someone to then do that on camera. If you've already said, well, you've already said this great stuff, you flag it up as being really great. Could we just say that on camera? That can be a really kind of efficient way of getting some video content out of it. And the same with some graphic content as well. Kind of using the written piece as the kind of foundation, and then split it, kind of out of that, going back to people and saying, could you just give us 5 minutes of your time on video as well? And normally, because they've said it and you send them the notes again, they'll probably say, yeah, okay, that's good. And you say to them, I found this the most interesting bit that you said. Could we talk about that a bit more? So yeah, I think it's kind of, it can be a gift that can keep giving in that way if you can get the right answers in the first place. Sorry, Roisin, it's 11:45. Is there anything else you would add? I know I don't mean to suddenly put the brakes on everything. Thanks, Andy. Amazingly, you're decorating and providing questions, answers, and a summary points. This is extraordinary. You're a man of many skills all at once. So thank you for that. But yeah, I hope, Roisin, would you add anything else? I think
No, I don't think so. That's.
Anyone else got any? It's been a bit of a chat, hasn't it, as we've gone on. So thanks for the questions. I hope that was useful. We'll share some links and bits and bobs as well. So and the recording after this. So yeah, if that's okay with everyone.
Yes.
Then thank you ever so much for joining us today. And I'll